Thank you for having me today. I was saying to Diane, the last time I was in Mendel, I was a 78 grad in economics, and I had a computer course, and they used those cardboard little Fortran cards with the holes in them. You remember that? That's where computers were back then. So that's how old I am, despite my boyish, youthful appearance. And I got my law degree from Villanova in '81, so I was here for a long. And I actually taught a course in political science here, adjunct faculty, and I learned a valuable lesson, which is I have no teaching skills at all. So anyway, having said that, this is a 15-minute. I'm going to talk for 15 and stop wherever I am. As far as the, I'm going to talk about climate and energy mainly, and fitting into the energy piece is the Marcellus drilling piece, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But first, the political configuration in Harrisburg, because that drives everything. And the short version of that is that the House and Senate in Pennsylvania is very conservative. It has gotten more conservative over time. Very difficult to get good things done environmentally with that legislature. It's almost like we're playing defense, as Adam knows, most of the time. Very conservative. We got a break with our gubernatorial election. Governor Wolf is very progressive on environmental issues. His campaign is riddled with good environmental promises, which he actually, as time goes by, is keeping. So Wolf, and one indication that Wolf is going to do good things environmentally are the people he's surrounded himself with. His first four choices in the environmental realm are Katie McGinty, his chief of staff, who worked in the Gore administration and is smart as a whip on energy issues. His chief of staff, his policy secretary, John Hanger, is also a Department of Environmental Protection secretary. Two of the smartest people, Katie McGinty and John Hanger, on energy issues that I think Pennsylvania has. So surrounding himself with those top people, I think, really is indicative of an administration who's going to be sensitive to environmental issues. His Department of Environmental Protection Secretary, John Quigley, and his Department of Conservation and Natural Resources Secretary, Cindy Dunn, are both people who I've known for years, have demonstrated their commitment to the environment in the nonprofit sector. Both have worked for Penn Future, and really are great. It's almost like a dream environmental team he's put in place with those four people. Okay, climate and energy. Climate is such an incredibly important issue. It's an issue I've focused in on in Pennsylvania. And scientists tell us that unless we keep the Earth from warming about 2 degrees Celsius, we are going to really change the Earth's atmosphere from a point where civilization evolved. I mean, we have to keep it at that 2 degrees Celsius level. And since the Industrial Revolution, we've put enough CO2 into the atmosphere to raise it 1 degree Celsius. So you kind of have to look at climate change as us as a planet having a carbon budget, and we've used about half of it. The key with regard to Pennsylvania is we as a state produce about a full 1% of the world's greenhouse gases. We do that through the utility sector. We have coal-fired power plants, we have natural gas-fired power plants, and in the transportation sector, we have tons of cars and trucks. So we really we are a net energy exporter, and so we have this sort of special responsibility. And statistics show that over 3/4 of the energy consumed in Pennsylvania comes from fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal. And only 4% come from renewables like wind and solar and geothermal and so forth. One thing I think we as a state can do to deal with climate change is increase something called our alternative energy portfolio standard, which is a law which requires utility companies like PECO, electric distribution companies like PECO, to get a certain percent of their electricity from renewable sources. Right now, that AEPS, as it's called, requires about 8% by 2020. I have a bill, House Bill 100, I just introduced, would bump that up to 15% by about 2023. That would still keep us well below states like New Jersey and other neighboring states. We're not doing enough as far as that goes. Another bill I've introduced is, or another very successful program Pennsylvania has had in the past is the Sunshine Solar program. You know, if you know of someone who's may have put in solar panels on their home or their business, they very well may have gotten a rebate from the Solar Sunshine program. But that ran out of funds at the end of 2013. It needs to be refunded. Wolf's budget, which he just announced Tuesday before last, would provide a funding source for that. I've also introduced a bill, House Bill 200, that would provide a dedicated funding source for the Solar Sunshine program. Those two bills work on the supply side to incent more renewable energy as far as a way to deal with climate change. The other piece is to the demand side, trying to reduce the demand for fossil fuels. We passed a bill back in 2008, it's called Act 129, that requires electric distribution companies to work on their demand side to try to get their customers to use less electricity. And you may have, you know, if you've purchased, let's say, a refrigerator and got a $50 rebate back from PECO, that was one of their efforts, for example, to try to get you to reduce your demand for electricity. We need to keep working on reducing the demand side. I've introduced a bill, House Bill 129, that would actually expand this legislation to gas distribution companies. Right now it just applies to electric distribution companies, like gas distribution companies like PGW in Philadelphia or PECO out here, people who deliver that natural gas to your home, forcing them to do things that are going to cause the demand of customers to be reduced. So as far as dealing with climate change, you want to incent renewables, you want to reduce demand, and one of the things as it relates to natural gas is dealing with something called fugitive methane emissions. Methane emissions, natural gas, the gas that sort of comes out of your burner at home, that natural gas, pretty much all of that is methane. And methane, in addition to, there's actually 6 greenhouse gases. CO2 is just one of them, but methane is the second most prominent. And so natural gas is methane, which is a greenhouse gas. And if it is, when it's burnt, it releases CO2 into the atmosphere. But when it's unburned, it also is a more powerful greenhouse gas than CO2. The statistics vary, but fugitive methane emissions, when released into the atmosphere, if it leaks out of the gas line on its way from the well to your burner tip, if it leaks into the atmosphere unburned, that actually is many times, I've heard 80 times, you know, it varies, but it's much more potent than CO2, but it has a shorter shelf life. So one of the things we as a state, we as a country, we as a world need to do is reduce these fugitive greenhouse gas emissions. And again, they occur anywhere from the time you drill a gas well, anywhere along that distribution scheme, through the gathering lines and the compressor stations and the pipelines and so forth, anywhere from the time it's actually burnt in your home or at a power station, it can go into the atmosphere. So it's really that the state is coming out. They've announced they're coming out with regulations that would deal with these fugitive methane emissions. And a lot of that goes with, you know, leak detection, frequency of inspection, using better equipment to inspect, using better equipment that has tighter sealants and so forth, replacing old pipes. There's a lot of things you can do to reduce methane emissions, but it's a very important thing to do if you want to deal with climate change. Let's shift to Marcellus Shale drilling. I mean, there's sort of 3 pieces to that. Let's see how long how far we can get. I mean, there's, as far as Marcellus Shale drilling, there's the regulation piece, the location piece, the taxation piece. how it can be regulated to make it safer, where should the drilling be done and not done, and the taxing of the drilling. I mean, first, what is fracking? What is Marcellus shale drilling? It's also called unconventional drilling. Essentially, it deals with the normal well drilling, where a well goes straight into the ground and pulls out what it finds. In that, there is a shale formation which covers 60% of Pennsylvania and extends to surrounding states. Roughly, this is the short version, starts about a mile down, and it's a thick formation, and it's shale. It's solid rock, which is entrapped in it natural gas. And through a relatively new drilling technology called hydrofracturing, it's now economically feasible to get it out. So essentially what happens is you drill down about a mile, and then you drill horizontally in various directions for maybe up to 2 miles. So you get your bore there, and then you, once that's done, you essentially pump, and for each well it's about 3 million gallons of water, so enormous quantities of water. You mix it with various, you mix the water with sand and other chemicals of varying degrees of toxicity. You essentially blast it down there, and you blast this rock open. The sand kind of keeps those crevices open, and then the gas starts flowing back. And that's kind of the short version of hydrofracturing. And in Pennsylvania, there's been about 9,000 of these wells drilled to date, and there's many more potentially that areas that can be drilled. There are environmental risks to hydrofracturing, and maybe me and Adam might disagree on this point. I'm not. It's never been my political position to ban fracking entirely, and I think the reason it's important to view because it's not enough, frankly, to say, listen, fracking has problems. You have to say, if you don't frack, what are you going to do? If you don't get your electricity to keep these lights on from natural gas, you're going to do it from coal. You're going to do it from nuclear. I mean, there are, frankly, again, 4% of our electricity comes from wind and solar. It's just not there to keep the lights on right now. That's essentially the problem. So you have to look at, what will happen if you don't frack. I mean, nuclear is an extremely dangerous activity. You have the problems of meltdowns, you have the problems of terrorist activities and so forth, but risks to some degree are managed. Coal, if you make your electricity from coal, maybe more of a CO2 impact. We can debate the methane emission issue. More of a CO2 impact, more conventional pollutants like mercury and SOx and NOx, disruption to the ground in extracting coal. So the problem in saying fracking's bad, we don't want to do it, is okay, fine. What's going to happen if you don't do it, and what are going to be the environmental consequences of that other activity, be it coal or whatever it might be. As mentioned, hydrofracking is a very industrial activity. You go to these drilling sites. It's gated. There's these tons of truck traffic, and I've been to at least a half dozen sites. Tons of truck traffic. Bigger roads are put in. Huge retention basins. 24/7 operation. Flaring in the middle of the night. They turn really nice areas into really industrial sites. They're really not. It's not a nice thing in the wrong places. Another problem with fracking deals with what do you do with the I'm running out of time. The flowback. I got to move along here, don't I? Let's talk a little bit about the location issues. The problem with where they're putting it now is you shouldn't be putting it on public lands. You shouldn't be putting it in state forests. You shouldn't be putting it in state parks. I've introduced legislation that would prevent both those things. It should be reserved for private lands and in the right places. The governor recently signed a moratorium on state forest leasing. Governor Wolf did, which I fully support. Another issue is the Delaware River Basin. Governor Wolf pledged, there's no drilling going on right now in the Delaware River Basin. Governor Wolf has pledged not to let that happen. The good thing in his budget is he restored most of the funding that Governor Corbett cut in the Delaware River Basin. There's an interesting issue there we can talk more about in the Q&A. Oil and gas lease fund, we'll save that for another day. I'm at the 15-minute point. I said I'd stop, and I'm going to stop. So, Adam, I'll let you take it from here, and I need to give you this, don't I? Okay.
You can tell Greg could talk for a very long time about environmental issues, and him and I could probably talk all day.
We could. And we work together.
We do.
We're teammates, and he does a great job, and this group does a great job.
I'll see. Let me see if I can do a few things. So I'm going to try and do a few things a little differently than Greg. So one, I just want to kind of talk about what Penn Environment's role is in the political process and pushing environmental policy forward on all these issues. And then two, talk a little bit about some of the issues Greg touched on around climate change and energy policy and gas drilling with two slightly, I think, different perspectives. One is we do a lot of work at the national level, and there's a lot of roles for the Obama administration and for Congress to play around these issues. So talk for a moment about that. And then two, I think as Greg mentioned a little bit, our role's a little different in the process, and we have a different take on some of these issues. So I'll kind of talk about what we're focused on right now around them. And I'll try and do it in 10 minutes or so we have plenty of time for questions and answer. So Penn Environment's a statewide environmental advocacy group. So at the core, our role is creating the political support it takes to pass strong environmental policies at the local, at the state, and at the federal level. So sadly, I don't get to work in Harrisburg with 253 representative Vitalis. I'd be out of a job. My life would be pretty easy. It'd be awesome. Sadly, in Harrisburg, there are a number of elected officials who don't see the world the way I think we do at Penn Environment, which is a place where we want to have our streams protected for fishing and swimming, where we want to protect our communities from the toxic chemicals used in the fracking process, where we want to slash the massive amounts of carbon pollution from power plants that are fueling climate change that's led to massive flooding and damages in the southeastern part of the state. And that's because, unfortunately, in a lot of these issues, it's not just environmentalists doing this work, but there are powerful corporations, the coal companies, the oil companies, we could kind of go on, the developers who are spending millions and millions of dollars influencing public policy, and I think mostly not the way people in this room and not the way the general public thinks. In fact, if you look at any polling on any environmental issue across the board, if it's climate change, a new poll just showed 82% of Pennsylvanians want strong action on climate change. 82%. But yet we're still fighting over whether we're going to slash the largest source of carbon pollution. If it's about protecting our streams, the majority of Pennsylvanians want our streams protected from pollution and want the Clean Water Act to protect every single stream in the state. But sadly, 49,000 miles of streams in the state of Pennsylvania are unprotected under the Clean Water Act, one of our most important environmental laws. So that's kind of the quick problem in a nutshell. So we do it by a few ways. First, we do the research on environmental problems and the solution. So now I'm going to pick on someone, my friend Sophie. This summer, Sophie, I know, see, she's already upset at me, worked at Penn Environment on our clean energy and climate campaign. She released a report called Shining Cities, which looked at the most successful cities in the nation on solar power and highlighted Philadelphia as a growing solar power in the entire nation. She held a press conference with the head of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers at the Friends Center downtown, was on KYW. So that leads to the second thing. So first we did the research on the report, then Sophie helped release the report and got coverage in the Philadelphia media market, one of the biggest media markets in the state, to educate hundreds of thousands of people about how solar power is rising as a way to slash pollution and the policies that can be implemented by folks like Representative Vitale, like the Alternative Energy Portfolio Standard, and by our legislators in DC that will drive solar power forward. So that gets us to the second step, which is educating the public. We do it through media work. We released a report last week on oil trains. Who saw about the oil trains disaster in West Virginia Ontario. Pretty scary, right? Anyone see those pictures? Pretty terrifying, the big fireball that exploded. Unfortunately, almost 4 million Pennsylvanians live within the half-mile evacuation zone of oil trains. They go through all our communities. We don't know where they go. They go right, one of the disasters was a half mile from my house in South Philly, and the information isn't publicly disclosed. We did an interactive map online with a group called Fracking last week that looks at exactly where those oil trains go. The report was covered in over 60 media outlets around the state and every major media market in the state. We released it with firefighters, with elected officials, with the councilwoman in Philadelphia to highlight the dangers, which gets me to my third piece, which is we can't do it on our own. So the third piece is bringing in allies across the community. So whether it's firefighters on oil trains or working right here at Villanova with Dr. Ruth McDermott Levy in the nursing department, who we've been working closely with on fracking to highlight the health dangers of fracking across the state of Pennsylvania and hold the Department of Health to get them more engaged in this issue. And then the last piece is the citizen. So at the core, we just think people need to be involved in the political process. We think it's not always that easy. It's not always that clear how to do it. And so we run a pretty large engagement operation to educate hundreds of thousands of people and bring them into the political process, whether it's writing emails, making a phone call, coming and meeting with Senator Casey or people like Representative Talley. So that's kind of where Penn Environment fits in the political process. And I think it's a pretty critical role in passing a whole bunch of environmental policies. So then for us, there's probably two big issues on the energy front that Greg touched on. The first is around climate change. I'm not going to, Greg talked very well about the dangers of climate change, and I think for folks in this room, you pretty well know it, about why it's so bad. But there is a big opportunity I want to talk about on the policy side that folks may or may not be aware of. So under the Clean Air Act, the EPA started a few years ago looking at regulating carbon pollution from power plants. Power plants in Pennsylvania are responsible for 48% of the state's global warming pollution. So they're our single largest source of global warming pollution, and they're allowed to spew as much as they want. In fact, so just the Pennsylvania power plants, if you kind of do the math out with what Greg did, are responsible 0.5% of the entire world's global warming pollution just from the power plants sitting in our state. That's pretty astounding. So the EPA has proposed a rule to slash that pollution by 32% by 2030, which would get us kind of on track with what scientists say we have to do to avoid even worse impacts. So to see that, you know, anything more than that 2-degree increase in temperature that Greg was talking about a moment ago, that will kind of make a huge swath of the areas that people live in totally unlivable, will make parts of Florida potentially disappear in the long term as ice caps melt and sea levels rise. And so the EPA actually has proposed this rule last summer and went on a big process to understand what the public thought. And it's really important about how it's playing out here in Pennsylvania for a few reasons. So the first is, since Pennsylvania is just such a large part of the problem, we have to be a large part of the solution. And so we're required to cut our carbon pollution from power plants by 32%. But the EPA decided to let things be flexible, and this is where the state and Governor Wolf's really going to come in. So they didn't mandate how the state would meet those standards. Instead, they said, here are kind of 4 building blocks, which Greg touched on. The first is solar and renewable energy. So how can you get more things? So can we get the alternative energy portfolio standard through the state legislature to boost our renewables and cut pollution that way? The second is energy efficiency. It's the cheapest, easiest, quickest, most effective way to cut pollution and save people money. In fact, new studies show that in Pennsylvania, we could cut our energy bill by 10 to 20% if we just really went aggressively after energy efficiency policies in the state. And this is actually played out in Maryland. I was actually at an event last week with the former governor, Martin O'Malley, and he was talking about how in Maryland, they've cut their energy bills by 15% because they've implemented energy efficiency policies. And the state is in the midst of looking at renewing its cornerstone energy efficiency program. What was House Bill 2200, Act 13, not Act 13, it's Act, what act is that? I can't remember now. The energy efficiency stuff. Act 129, which will help provide incentives for utilities and for homeowners to cut energy use. The third is natural gas. So Greg touched on this. Natural gas, I'll come to this in a moment. I'm for banning fracking. Let me be very, very clear. I see things a little differently, though we work together. But gas is at the burning point, at least, a better solution on global warming than coal, though not in the overall picture because of the methane releases. And so that's a third option. And the first is a power plant efficiency, so making existing power plants more efficient. So this could be everything from installing scrubbers to just getting more power for the same amount of coal you're burning. And they've left it up to the states to decide. So there's two places where this is going to play out in Pennsylvania. First, I think it's just a huge opportunity for the state. This mandate is coming down in probably this summer, and the state will have a year to develop a plan. That means the Wolf administration is going to have a year to figure out how we're going to meet the 30% reduction goals and put policies in place. And he started a good down payment in his budget address, pledging $250 million bond program to invest in renewables and solar and energy efficiency programs in the state. But it's going to take a lot of work to get it done. And it's going to take things like new legislation passing in Harrisburg. If we don't meet those standards, if people are curious, what will happen is we'll move to what's a federal program known as a Federal Implementation Plan, or FIP. So the EPA can just mandate on the states what they're going to do. I'm not for that. I want to cut carbon pollution. I'd rather have the states have the autonomy and the ability, but it's going to require some action from our elected officials, and it's going to require people to speak out. And how proactive we are in this decision-making process will determine how impacted the plan is on the state and how well it does its job. The second piece is Senator Casey. So as I mentioned earlier, politics isn't always as easy as working with folks like Representative, and I like Senator Casey a lot, so don't get me wrong on that. I work really closely with them. But the senator's on the fence on this issue, sadly, and there is going to be a vote later this year to halt the EPA from tackling climate change. There's a bunch of ways they can do it. We can talk more about how they can do it. But the EPA, there's going to be a vote on whether the EPA is going to implement action on, be able to implement this rule. And we can't win that vote without Senator Bob Casey. It's that simple. When you do the math out and you look at the vote count, you're going to lose the vote any day of the week without the senator on our side. I met with him the other week in DC, and he has two big concerns about the rule. 1.5, I can't really decide. But his big concern is, how do we meet the standard? Can Pennsylvania actually meet the goals laid forth in the plan, which requires us to get to 16% renewables by 2030 in the current version of the plan? And we are working very closely to make sure he knows, one, we can do that, and then two, that we're going to move forward. But we need him on our side, so there's a bunch of work to do there, and Pennsylvania, therefore, is playing a key national role in this issue. So that's climate change. It's probably the biggest federal thing going on climate change. It's the largest thing we'll ever do, and it's going to drive state environmental policy for years to come, honestly, on this issue. On fracking, Greg and I see it a little differently, so I'll tell you why really quickly, but I work really closely with him on a ton of regulation. There's a lot the state can do. The reason we see it differently is because of what's happening right now. So I'm going to tell you a story. There's a family out, the Baumgardners, Gary Baumgardner. They live out in Washington County, southwestern Pennsylvania. Lot of fracking going on there. In mid-December, I got a call from Gary because fracking was happening right across the street for his home, not on his land. He's lived there for a decade. His sister, his kids live down the street with their granddaughter, and they wanted to have Christmas dinner together like they have every single year. But unfortunately, since fracking has started, every time their 6-month-old granddaughter comes to visit their home with their daughter and their son-in-law, she has health problems. She starts coughing. She has had some rashes on her skin, and they went to the doctor, and the doctor said, your granddaughter can no longer come to your house. You are putting her life at risk for years to come if she even visits you because a fracking site is so close to your home, through nothing you did wrong. So they went to EQT and said, hey, EQT, can you shut down for 3 days so that we can have Christmas dinner together? That's all they want. I mean, they're not even thinking about beyond 3 days. We just want to have Christmas dinner together. And EQT said, no, we are going to frack on Christmas Day. We don't care. And even when it ran in the papers and they got asked by a reporter, they said, we will frack every single day at this well. And that is the sad truth in a lot of these communities as you talk to these folks. There are some benefits, there are other problems, but when you talk to folks in the communities, they are experiencing this every single day. And through no decision of their own, no ability to control their own lives, they are faced with this problem. I've seen family after family who face this, who mothers and fathers, parents, who are making decisions about whether they have to just throw away their entire home because they can't sell it anymore for worth anything, and move away for the sake of their kids, and literally crying to me as they wonder what they're putting their kids through. until we can figure out, until the gas drilling industry can figure out how to get this problem under control and put people's health first, they should have no job in the state. They should not be running. They should not be fracking, because this is the thing that's happening again and again. Now, if the drilling companies can come back and prove they can do it safely, and if folks like Ruth here at Villanova can say, here's how we're doing it safely, and independent doctors and experts can verify that, then we can have that discussion, but not until then. So that's our stance on fracking. In the meantime, on the politics, I'm not going to get a ban anytime soon. It's hard enough in Harrisburg. So we're working with Greg on a bunch of things to make it safer to frack, but it's a short-term Band-Aid on the problem. And there's a bunch of work happening on this, from banning toxic waste pits. A new rule came out yesterday proposed to end the use of open-air waste pits, where you can literally walk right up to a waste pit filled with toxic chemicals from the fracking process, and literal animals are drinking out of it, and they're overflowing into streams. There's a new rule coming out from the DEP in the next few months to deal with the methane pollution that Greg was talking about. And there's a lot more happening there, but we have a long way to go as a state. So I'm going to stop a little bit now, and I think bring Greg back up, but I want to give plenty of time for questions. As you can tell, there's a lot to cover on this issue about where the state's going and the policy and the politics, but we want to have lots and lots of time for questions. So I think that's...
Yeah, I think we definitely wanted to build in lots of time for discussion and questions. So I got to direct your questions to Greg or...
And I guess I have to ask a question for the video in the back. Do you want me to try and pass this back and forth? Okay. Okay. Who's got a question? Yes, sir.
In one of the earlier talks in the series, there was this matter about the muzzling of state health workers who were fielding
Yep.
questions about health problems related to
Fracking.
Has Governor Wolf reversed that policy? Because that would seem, I mean,
Yeah.
you told a story, and
Yep.
the gas company will come back and say, well, this is just anecdotal. What's
Yep.
your evidence?
Yeah.
And the source of that evidence would be...
There's two things on this. So actually,
Study.
yeah. So what he's talking about is over the summer. The question was that there was a story this summer about the Department of Health muzzling employees when it came to complaints about fracking. It was released in State Intact, an NPR program, and went pretty wide. After that happened, Penn Environment joined with Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environment and Physicians for Social Responsibility and Ruth here to actually release a letter from about 400 doctors and nurses across the state calling for a series of reforms of the Department of Health, including removing that policy in a public health registry and more. So actually, there's kind of three things in here. Once that story broke, actually within a month or so, the Department of Health came out and said, we are changing our policy. So since then, theoretically, the policy has been changed, and they have started doing investigations on it. Then the second piece here is we don't know what that looks like yet. So I think the governor's administration has pledged that, and focused a lot on the Department of Health's engagement on fracking, and so they're looking at what it can do, but it takes a little bit of time. And so I think they are fixing that and coming up with a more robust response policy. And then they have said that they want to institute a public health registry, which is something that Ruth is really the expert on, but basically a system to at least initially gather all the information about potential fracking health problems from doctors and nurses and health experts in the Department of Health into one system, which would allow better research across the board on these issues, to your point, and would allow make sure we're responding appropriately to these concerns and have a better sense of the problems around fracking. That, I think, proposal they'll try to move forward in the next 6 months. They need to get funding for it as part of the budget process, and I think it was in the budget proposal, but I don't remember.
$100,000 in the budget for a health registry, but the amount of that was low compared to the initial $2 million.
Yep,
that
was
put
requested.
in Act 13 before it was cut out. But I think in general, so much of what the employees of a State Department do is driven from the
Yep.
top. And Governor Corbett was
extremely pro-drilling, very much in favor of just giving drillers a free rein. I think the Wolf administration, although still in favor of gas development, is much more in tune to the safety aspects of it. Make sure the regulations are in place, increasing staffing, keeping it out of the wrong locations. So I do think that in general, the employees of the Department of Health and other state agencies will be able to be more forthcoming in what they can and can't say about.
And then one other thing to add, just quickly, I met with Secretary Quigley, who's the new head of the DEP, and he said he's already sat down and met with the physicians general, the governor's new physicians general, and the new head, Karen Murphy, of the health department to have this exact discussion. So I even think the fact that John and these three folks are saying, how were we all connecting on this issue just outside of the health registry and everything else, is a huge step forward.
Has Pennsylvania considered a feed-in tariff at all? I know that a lot of other countries do that. You mentioned the portfolio standards.
It has not been discussed in any.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah.
Has Pennsylvania considered a feed-in tariff with regard to renewables? And the short answer is it has not been discussed in any formal setting. For example, I'm on the Environmental Resource and Energy Committee. It has really not been discussed at the committee level or in any formal setting. Most discussion has been on the alternative energy portfolio standard and whether that's good or bad.
You're asking, I think, just the question is, has there been research on what the water they use in the fracking process? And
I think you kind of have to view the water usage issue with regard to hydrofracturing in two ways. One is the piece of the actual volume you use and take out of the system, and the other piece is once that water is mixed with the chemicals, goes through the system, and a fraction of it comes back, can it be safely disposed? My take on that may differ from yours, but I'll give you my take really quickly. As a general rule, with regard to the volume of water used, that's not considered the chief environmental concern, because other power industries use a lot of water too. And although when you hear about 3 million gallons per well, it seems like a lot, but proportionately, it's not considered a lot. So the main problem is not so much what you're taking out of the system, and just to build on that a little bit, what you're taking out of the system is regulated by the various river basin commissions. For example, the Susquehanna River Basin Commission has to give a permit to those drillers who want to take water out of the Susquehanna River Basin, and they will only permit enough so that the water levels don't get low enough so the flora and the fauna of the streams are not impacted. So you can take less in the summer when things are dry and so forth. Okay, the next piece is the water usage. So when you contaminate the chemicals, and interestingly enough, it's not so much the chemicals you add to the water when you frack and break open the rock that are the only danger. Once that water goes through and breaks up the rock, it actually also picks up more toxic chemicals, some radioactive elements too. And about 80%, well, the figures vary, but let's just say 80% for the sake of argument, stays down there, stays a mile deep. So that doesn't come up. So that's one issue. And the issue is that far enough away from the groundwater, which is at a much higher level? Many people will say the distance between the two is big enough not to pose a danger, but with every issue there is debate. The water that does come back, it's called either flow back or produced water that comes out of the well, let's say the 20% of what you put in there. More and more these days are actually being recycled. About 90+% are now being recycled. The drillers are actually
taking the toxics out, getting it to a base level of water, then using it again. It makes financial sense for them, and it's also being driven by the fact of the stringent discharge standards that are there. So, and some is of what is not recycled. Some is deep well injected in Ohio. There's some earthquake issues there.
Yeah, we don't do it.
But a very small amount is put back into the waterways these days. A very small amount.
And then I'll take a different take than Greg on one or two things. So on your question, I don't think there's been a study recently done about the impacts on the water. When they first started taking water out of the system, they took it so much and there was not a really good permitting process in place. We actually did have streams, little local streams, run dry in some of these communities. That problem seems to have mostly been solved as the permitting process has gotten better. There's probably a few things we should do on this issue. So one is something Greg touched on, which is unlike a power plant where 99% of the water basically goes back into the water cycle, evaporates, come back down in rain. You know, as anywhere from, depending on who you ask, 50 to 80% of this water basically never returns to the water cycle. So I do think it's a different process. And right now, there is, they don't get charged for removing water. So it's a free thing. They have to file a permit, but it's free to the companies. We think, and I think Representative Sterling last session introduced a bill to charge the companies the same rate each one of us pays on our water bill. For this water, which will do two or three things. One, it will create a source of funding that the state could use for a whole bunch of environmental protection, for renewables, for education, and things like that. Two, it will incentivize it will create basically an incentive for the companies to figure out how to bring up more of the water, recycle more of the water, and use less water overall to get to your problem. So I think that's probably the biggest, easiest way to tackle this issue, but we probably need a little more study because the other thing on this, which we didn't really touch on, is right now drilling in the state is slowing down because prices are so low. So it's kind of a lull period both on the problem side and on the drilling and gas side right now. That will probably change in the next year as prices go back up. But, so that's another piece of it. There was I know, sir, you had I don't know if you still have a question. You had your hand up before. Yeah, sorry, and then we'll get over there.
So if you look at the history of fracking in Pennsylvania or any of the northeast states, it started with people moving from Texas, sort of being renegade outside the
Yeah.
law, didn't look at drilling housings, didn't look at well housings.
Yeah.
A lot of horror stories. Okay?
Yep.
As we move forward in time, we're a decade later now, and the Exxon Mobils and the Chevrons and the
Yeah.
rigorous compliance and EH&S folks are getting involved. Is it making a difference?
So,
And is
yeah.
ETQ, I never heard of them. Are they associated with a major oil producing company, or are they a smaller organization?
Yeah, it's a great question. Let's see, EQT is, which is a big driller out in western Pennsylvania. They own more leases than most of the companies actually. They are now associated, I believe, with Exxon, if I remember this right. But they're a big player. They're not a small mom and pop shop either way. And then the sad reality is a lot of people thought this exactly would play out. You'd have these people, these like mom and pop shops essentially and wildcatters who would come out and they'd have 10 wells they drill and they just make their money, fold up shop, move away, so they had no value in the society, really in the community and no real consequences because they just make their money and move on. The sad reality is no, we're not seeing it play out that the bigger entities, whether it's Exxon or EQT or Range Resources or Chesapeake, are playing the drill, are drilling any better than the small mom pop shops. In just one instance on this, we released a report back in, I guess it was December or January, Fracking Failures, which looked at who are the companies that have the largest number of serious environmental violations in the most recent available data year, which was 2013. And we found that if you took the 20 worst companies, they had over 1,000 serious environmental violations, just the 20 worst, and that they really ranged in type. So you had the Atlases of the world, which is a smaller mom and pop shop, so to speak, in the world of drilling, and you had EQT as one of the worst as well, and I think Chesapeake is one of the worst. So what we found in our report was across the board, the biggest and the smallest were having the problems. The second report that came out was, as folks may have heard, this group came together called the Center for Sustainable Shale Development, which was supposed to be a collaboration between a set of funders, environmental groups, and drilling companies with some voluntary standards that were supposed to be higher than what's mandated by law today and are. A study came out from the Delaware Riverkeeper Network looking at how those were being followed by the companies that are part of creating that entity to kind of have voluntary better standards and be good corporate stewards. And they found that the same companies that were part of this entity were not following their own voluntary standards that the entity had created. So what we're mostly finding is it doesn't really matter. They can't seem to, and I think the core reason is the consequences are mostly small. So you violate the environmental laws, you get slapped with a $50,000 fine. Everyone in this room thinks $50,000 is a lot of money, but when you make millions of dollars on every well you drill, it's just the cost of doing business. And I don't know if you have other, that's our take, but.
Right. I do think that under the current administration, the corporate administration again was very sympathetic to it. You will get more enforcement under Wolf. I do think over time you have seen an improvement in the way drillers are doing business. And I think you see that with the percent of wastewater that's being recycled. Under the Renewable administration, 2 sets of regulations were enacted: the wastewater discharge and the well construction standards sets of regulations. The well construction standards was meant to deal with the Dimick situation. You've all seen Gaslands with Dimick and those wells and Cabot and the way it. So there are regulations in place. I think the reality is these drillers understand that it's in their own. There's so much money to be made here. It's in their own financial interest to do it right. They don't want to kill the goose that lays the golden egg, and they do have the money because they are these huge companies. They do have more money to clean up the messes they've made. And drilling in Pennsylvania is we're still only about 6-7 years in. So I think over time they are, by trial and error, getting better at what they do. But they believe me, they realize they need the people of Pennsylvania with them. For this, I'm sorry. Okay.
Yeah. There's. Go.
With Frank Pratt for the science department, and I recall we talked last week, very well received there.
Okay. Thank you.
My question is on taxation. Can you get a chance to talk about the proposed severance tax by the governor? Can you talk a little bit about that, your position on it, its impact on building the gas prices, etc.?
Right. Right now there is an impact fee. It's a fee. It's a sort of a set of fees based on wells drilled, and the effective rate of the impact fee, which we passed a couple of years ago, is estimated to be about 1.9%. So it's about a 1.9% tax on the value of drilling. That is very low compared to other states who right now have a severance tax per se, like Texas is over 7%, I think Oklahoma is over 7%. Governor Wolf has proposed a severance tax which is identical to West Virginia's, it's a two-pronged tax. One deals with the value of the gas, which is 5% of the market value of the gas, and then the second piece deals with volume. So it's the 5% of the market value of the gas plus 4.7 cents per 1,000 cubic feet. So it's both market value of the gas and volume of the gas. That is, in my mind, a very fair thing. Should be done. Do not believe the drillers for a second when they say that it's going to drive business out of the state. We can get into that answer. So in general, he's proposed a tax, a competitive tax, supportive of it. We need the revenues. They should be paying for it. I'll let you go.
Yeah, we don't see the severance tax as an environmental policy. It's a taxation and economic policy. we have supported it in the past. I think we're kind of, at the end of the day, like I said, because we don't see it as it doesn't, since most of the money isn't going to the environment, it's going to education, which again, I have no problem. I live in Philadelphia. I live 50 feet from a school that's falling apart. I get it, so, but so we don't see it as an environmental policy, so we're mostly kind of indifferent. That being said, I mean, I think we'd probably support it, but like, we're just kind of indifferent on the thing. I think it will. My guess is it will pass. I'll put my prediction down today. I think it will pass because you'll get some of the southeastern Republicans to support it, and there'll be a budget negotiation. And I think the question is actually what the governor has to give up to get his severance tax and education funding. But the Republicans who oppose it don't really want to take another hatchet to the education budget, and that's what we're talking about here. And I think that is good that it will pass at the end of the day. It's just not really an environmental policy from as far as we're really concerned.
So is there not any kind of push for transparency? Because if we assume that hydrofracking was a necessary evil, would it make more sense for the companies to have to disclose the chemicals they use? Or just kind of like with the BP oil spill, there was the state regulators dramatically understaffed. It's the same thing when it comes to these frac wells. Most of them aren't even visited by kind of regular check. Is the well cracked in any kind of places and stuff like that? So is there any push?
Yeah.
A lot of this stuff is pushing renewable resources, but is there any kind of push for transparency?
Yeah, there's a ton of different things on both transparency and increased regulations. I think part of what's playing out right now is since there's been such a shift in Harrisburg in the administration, from Governor Corbett being so pro-drilling to Governor Wolf being pro-drilling but having concerns about the environmental and health impacts that he wants to deal with, that my take is that it's just partially taking some time. But the two or three things I'll just say is, one, yesterday the Department of Environmental Protection came out with new updated regulations around gas drilling and wastewater mostly, and waste pits. Greg and I were talking about this. We're still kind of reading through them and analyzing them, but it seems like a huge step forward in dealing with this problem and creating more transparency. Two, when I met with the head of the Bureau of Oil and Gas, a guy named Scott Perry, who's been around forever, and talked also, John Quigley was in the room. They talked a lot about transparency and how they can get more inspectors to the well sites and have more inspections to know what's going on. So in fact, as part of the budget, I think they're adding 15 new inspectors, is what Scott told me, to which he thinks will let them get up to their middle benchmark of like 3.5 inspections per well per year or something. Anyway, so we could talk about whether there should be more than that, but it's a huge step forward. So there's some of that. And then on the chemical disclosure, next week, Congressman Matt Cartwright from northeastern Pennsylvania, Scranton and Easton area will be introducing the Frack Pack, which is a package of legislation including the Frack Act and the Breathe Act, to basically re-include the fracking process in a set of our cornerstone environmental laws and close the Halliburton loophole, which would deal with the disclosure problem, would deal with a bunch of the water and air stuff and waste issues around it. The problem is, to me, isn't how to do this stuff. It's a political problem, which is it's very hard to get anything. I mean, getting things through DC is just mostly, just to be honest, a complete joke. We can talk about it forever, but I mean, I was down there the other week talking to a bunch of congressmen, and they were like basically laughing about, I mean, not laughing, but they were like, yeah, we're not going to get anything done. Like, they can't do it. I think, sadly, DC politics is so partisan and so dysfunctional. If you watch the thing on Iran that happened yesterday, it just seems like those people can't even come together on anything. And then I think in Harrisburg, it is a hard fight, and we'll see how it plays out on some of this stuff. So I think most of this stuff is where the regulatory agencies, so the Department of Environmental Protection and the EPA, can step in and deal with some of these concerns, and there's probably more possibility of that at the state level. But I don't know if you...
I mean, my own take on, and we may disagree on this a little bit, I wish I had my facts a little tighter, but such a crappy memory. But my take on the fracking fluid content issue is that it's really more apparent than real. I mean, we know
this is partially
exactly what chemicals are being used. And the drillers really don't care, because they get these chemicals from chemical groups. They outsource that. The combination of the proportion of which chemicals are used is something that the companies who make this like to kind of guard like they're the formula for Coca-Cola, like they're like them a little different. But there's really, I honestly, so we know what chemicals are being used. The emergency personnel out there knows all this stuff. It's kind of it's an issue that kind of makes a good rallying point, soundbite. It's not an issue that concerns me as much as it concerns other people. I don't think, I personally don't think there are much bigger issues.
I agree there's much bigger issues, and we actually, he's right, we do know there's kind of two things. We know the chemicals, some of them are considered proprietary, so we don't actually know what's in the chemical, so they'll have some weird name, but we do know a set of them, and then we don't know the proportions, which is a bit of a problem. But actually Pennsylvania specifically, unlike other states, has some specific state disclosure laws that help with this. And I tend to agree. I took the transparency question a little bit of a different direction, which there's a lot of other transparency than just the chemical thing that we could do and on the inspection side. I know Nat wanted to keep it to about an hour, but I think what I can say, and he'll come up in a second, is Greg and I will, I think, stick around for a while. We were going to also talk about, for people who are interested, how to get into politics or how to environmental careers, whether it's a job or an internship or other things down the road. I'm happy to talk whether you're a freshman, junior, senior. I've worked with all levels, and I was a freshman at some point and got my environmental career start when I was a freshman in Georgia, where I'm from. So we're happy, I think, to continue to answer some questions maybe and then talk about that a little bit, but I know I'm going to hand out.
So